Welcome to the second Paddock to Planning Forum. Really appreciate your time in coming today. I'm Tamara Prentice. I'm the manager of the Agricultural Land Use Planning team with New South Wales DPI. With me today, I've got some colleagues from my own team, as well as from some of the broader teams across DPI and some officers from the Department of Planning and Environment. So much appreciate their assistance today in running this forum. We've been completely overwhelmed by the volume of the response. Nearly 200 people have registered for today's meeting. And, when I first factored this project in, I thought we'd get maybe 15. So a little bit more than I'd expected and larger than sort of I'd anticipated preparing for. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country that we're working on. So the Department of Regional New South Wales acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the waters, and we show our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just some housekeeping for today. You would have got notice that the meeting's being recorded. That's purely so we can capture the thoughts and ideas from this forum. So the intention of this forum is for you guys to learn from each other, but also so that we can capture the information and make sure that the representations we're making on behalf of government consider the views on the ground that you guys are, subject to every day. So we're very much here to listen to what you've got to say and learn from you. If everyone could please stay on mute during the prezos, that'd be great. But please do come off mute during the breakout sessions. So there will be breakout sessions. Some of the team that are helping me today are not planners. So we're going to call on council officers to help facilitate those sessions, and my team will just act as a scribe for the conversation that you guys have amongst yourselves. We have an ideas wall. We'll put a link to that in the chat. We really appreciate the ideas that come from that, and it was the ideas wall that gave us the information to work out what topic to run now. We're working on some other policy in the background to respond to some of the information that came from the ideas wall during the first forum. So also, if you haven't already done so, can you please add your name and which council you are from on the Zoom profile. So next to the picture of yourself or the video of yourself, there's 3 little dots. So if you can click on that and then just put what council you're from, it just makes it a little bit easier for others to recognise where you're from. So today's forum, we're just going to go through what was said briefly in Forum 1 for a couple of minutes. After that, we've got a couple of councils presenting on what they have experienced with dual lock, rural workers dwellings and secondary dwellings, and just set the scene for the breakout rooms. We'll then all be transferred out to breakout rooms, so that's an automatic thing. There's a few questions for you guys to discuss amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back together and come to some conclusions about what was said, and have a bit of a question and answer session as well with ourselves and the council officers. So Forum 1 overview. So the most voted idea in Forum 1 was on buffers and how they can be used to manage land use conflict. The Department of Primary Industries has an interim buffer guideline some of you might be familiar with. So we are actually in the process of reviewing that document at the moment, possibly combining it with our land use conflict risk assessment guide, but just to try and make it a bit more contemporary and give it a bit more of a basis. The New South Wales Agriculture Commissioner, he also mentioned that buffers should be possibly a mandatory consideration in the planning framework. So we're looking at a government response to that and working out what that might look like. And obviously we'll do a bit more consultation with councils during that as well. The key themes from the ideas wall at the last session, they're up on the screen for you to have a look at. Some of those are being looked at extensively by other departments at the moment. So the one that we're looking at today, this topic, is a bit of a subset of planning for small farms and dwellings. So we're just touching on a small component of that. We may well have other sessions on different components of that in the future. But yeah, we didn't think we could cover a whole topic like that size in an hour session, and we wanted to keep these sort of bite-sized so everyone that came along, your days weren't too interrupted. But if you've got any ideas for the next session, please put them on the ideas wall. So we just want to start off now with a bit of a poll question that we have for you about whether you've experienced much in the way of the impacts of dual lock. When I was at council, I used to see it all the time, but yeah, just not sure. That was a long time ago now. Whether you guys are still seeing issues in relation to dual lock and rural workers and secondary dwellings in your rural areas. So everyone should be seeing the poll results on their screen at the moment. Yeah, so 64% of you have experienced land fragmentation pressures associated with these types of secondary dwellings in rural areas, and 36% not. So that's pretty good, actually. I was expecting a lot higher in terms of fragmentation requests going through council staff. So that's pretty encouraging. So I'm hoping that you guys have excellent policy which is stopping that from happening. But anyway, I'll hand over now to Wendy Goodburn. So Wendy Goodburn's going to host the next session along with some council officers.
Thanks, Tamara. And good morning, everybody. As Tamara mentioned, I'm just going to set the scene for the breakout sessions that we're going to have a little bit later on in the agenda. In terms of dual occupancies, secondary dwellings and rural workers' dwellings. So that was part of a larger topic that was raised in the last forum. And it's recognised that there's a need for these types of dwellings in the rural landscape. But I'm just focusing on various impacts and considerations and varying permissibilities, etc., from an agricultural perspective. You're probably all familiar in councils with the impacts of dual occupancy, secondary dwellings and rural workers' dwellings. Previous slide, thanks, Helen. One of the impacts is the capital value increase of surrounding properties, so that they're often the value increase with additional dwellings means that they're out of reach of new entrant farmers, or even farmers, wanting to expand their operations. There's other impacts there, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So I'll just move on to things to consider. So things that should be considered in terms of these types of dwellings is the impacts on the agricultural production, not only what's there at present, but what's there going to potentially be there in the future. And one of the other things is that houses are permanent fixtures, they're permanent structures and unlikely to be removed and the land's unlikely to be put back to agriculture. So if you have the next slide, thanks, Helen. And so just moving quickly on to rural workers' dwellings. Again, there's good reasons to have rural workers' dwellings in areas, particularly where they're not close to rental accommodation, so at a distance from urban settlements or settlements. But there is a need to have a direct nexus between agricultural productivity of the land and the rural worker working on the farm. There's a positive impact of rural workers' dwellings in that they can attract rural workers, and particularly in areas where there's not a lot of accommodation for rural workers, and that's something that's been apparent, particularly during the COVID time. We also need to consider that they may change to residential rather than rural worker purposes. The whole question, we just want to get an understanding from councils when agricultural businesses might require a rural workers dwelling in terms of your understanding. So if you could just quickly tick yes or no to that answer, that would be terrific. We'll just wait until the poll results come up. So the poll results, and most people have a good understanding of agricultural businesses, which is terrific. So it doesn't look like there's much of a need to support councils in that area. So that's great. So moving on to where we've actually invited Mark Rudderman from Willandilly Council and Simon Scott from Ballina Council to share their experiences with dual occupancy rural workers and secondary dwellings. So I'll hand over to Mark first.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Mark Rudderman. I'm a senior strategic planner at Wallandilly Council. Look, I guess just to set the scene a little bit, in our LGA we have 3 rural zones that are from the standard instrument. So the RU1 zone, the primary production, RU2 rural landscape, and RU4, which is primary production small holdings. We also have quite a few conservation or environmental zones as well. So in terms of dual occupancies in the Shire there, so dual occupancies are permitted in the rural zones, but only if they're attached. And we have some controls in our DCP regarding how that needs to be done. So, you know, it can't be attached by a breezeway or an awning or any of that type of thing. It needs to have the appearance of a single dwelling. The main reason that requirement's been in place for some time. The main reason is to, I suppose, firstly try and retain the rural landscape character, and also try and resolve or prevent rural land use conflicts, because quite a few areas of our rural lands are quite fragmented because of old subdivisions and so on. In terms of secondary dwellings, so secondary dwellings are permitted in the rural zones as either attached or detached structures. Up until just recently, there always has been a floor area limit that's applied, which has been 60 square metres or 25% of the total floor area of the main house, just to try and manage those scenic landscape issues and also rural land use conflict. But with the amendment that was made by the department about a year and a half ago to introduce the new clause into the standard instrument for specifically for secondary dwellings in rural zones, that's been removed. So at the moment, there's a bit of a gap where there's no actual floor area for secondary dwellings, which we're going. So we're currently undertaking a planning proposal to try and introduce an appropriate size to manage that. In terms of rural workers' dwellings, so once again, they're permitted in pretty much all of the rural zones and zones where agriculture is permitted. One of the challenges we've probably faced in recent years is that we were actually involved in a court case a couple of years ago, which established that once you have 3 or more dwellings on a particular lot, whether it be any combination of, dwelling, secondary dwelling, rural dwelling, or what have you, it constitutes multi-dwelling housing, which is prohibited in our rural zones. So in our rural land strategy that we adopted about a year and a half ago, we actually have an action in there to look at investigating options for temporary workers' dwellings to increase options for seasonal workers and that type of thing. So that's one of the things that we're going to try and look at going forward. I think my 3 minutes might be just about up. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that, Mark. It sounds like you've got some interesting challenges and some strategic work in place to manage some of those challenges. So that's really good to hear. We'll now pass to Ballina Shire Council, Simon Scott.
Good day, everyone. Yeah, so in our particular case, so we largely have 2 rural zones, the RU1 and the RU2 are used in our areas. In terms of the history of rural subdivision, we've got about 3,500 rural lots, of which about 68% are less than 5 hectares. So we're largely quite a rural shire, but we've got lots of rural subdivision, largely as a consequence of the concessional lots in the 60s. We have generally a 40 hectare minimum lot size, for some areas of 20. Being a lifestyle region, we've attracted a lot of rural residential occupation in a lot of these areas, particularly given their small lot size. And that has certainly put pressure on rural land use conflict, particularly in relation to some forms of rural tourism, such as wedding venues. we had traditionally, up until about 2017, we had only allowed attached dual occupancy, so they had to be within 10 metres and attached by a covered walkway. But in 2017, that was relaxed, and you could have detached dual occupancy, which has been in place for a few years. We have had some slight increase in the number of rural dwellings as a consequence of that, but it's only fairly moderate because there aren't that many opportunities out there. But yeah, so they're not, there's no distance requirement in relation to those rural dual occupancies, but they do have to have a single access and single septic system. In terms of rural workers' dwellings, we just really haven't had a lot of that in our shire historically, and is the nature of the provisions of the plan, which really indicate that these sorts of things have to have demonstrated economic capacity to support ongoing employment, and that it's necessary given the nature of the rural activity. And generally speaking, most of our rural areas are in a fairly reasonable proximity to existing residential areas, so that's how that's largely being accommodated, albeit becoming more challenging in the current climate with housing. And also, there's limitations to one rural workers dwelling, and that they not be that the land not be less than the amount of lot size, which, as I say, is 40 hectares, and that's probably a limitation as well, as well as the need. And yeah, that's pretty much what I got. I think the preparation of agricultural land use strategy is in our work program, so it's looking at all rural activity. Although I've got to say we're fairly concerned about the agritourism reforms. As I said at the beginning, one of our biggest concerns is around rural tourism, in particular rural wedding venues. We're very close to Byron Bay. There's a lot of that happening in Byron and in our shire as well, even under existing controls, often legally. So we're not sure whether we will proceed with the agricultural land use strategy until we've sort of had a better look at the potential implications of the rural agritourism reforms, because of the extent to which we're concerned about them. That's pretty much all I got.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for giving that overview, Mark and Simon. Simon, it seems like you have some similar issues to Wollondilly in that there's some fragmentation in place, but you've been managing to control that with some development control initiatives, albeit having still some ongoing challenges. Well, thank you very much for that. We'll now move on to our we'll have a group discussion in breakout rooms on dual occupancy secondary dwellings and rural workers dwellings. So in your groups, we'd like to consider 4 questions that are on the screen. Once we've considered those questions, you'll be shortly transferred back to your groups. Please put all your comments on the wall when you're in those groups, if you're, well, we encourage you to do that. So the basic outcome, I guess, from this discussion is to develop an understanding between the councils as to what key drivers are for permitting specific types of housing, those types of housing, and what has worked well, and what are some of the key learnings that you've understood from that, and if you'd make any changes. So we're trying to get a discussion going on, what worked and what didn't work, and what you do differently. So if you wait just a few minutes, we will transfer you to your room. Yeah, thank you for breaking to the discussion groups. We had some good discussion in our group. In order to share what was discussed, we'll just share a couple of outcomes from a couple of groups. We've just pre-selected a couple of groups just because we won't have time to share the discussion from all of the groups. So, Tamara, would you like to lead off and summarise the outcomes from your group?
Yeah, sure. Thanks to everyone in my group and for Council for facilitating, much appreciated. I'd done enough talking for the day. So primarily what had worked well in managing these types of dwellings for the councils in my group was either requiring them to be attached or clustered nearby one another, and that could be done either through like the requirement for a shared service septic system, or for shared services, or by a particular separation distance, or by an appearance as one dwelling to try and reduce clutter in the landscape. And one of the other things that we chatted about as well was with rural workers dwellings particularly, any requirements for them to be either decommissioned when the farm ceased or relocatable. But generally, the councils found it fairly useful. They had some DCP requirements around demonstration of the need and an ongoing need for a farm worker to be able to support the business that they were working on. So they were probably a couple of the key insights from my room. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks for that, Tamara. And Selena, could we ask you to report back from your group, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had some diversity within our group in terms of both coastal and inland councils. I guess some of the drivers that we looked at or had is in relation to, I guess, affordable housing or the need for some additional housing. I guess that's succession planning, so those transitional arrangements that we talked about earlier in the forum. And also another one that was of interest was the increasing land prices. So particularly those areas where there's a larger minimum lot size, that's really driving that desire or that need for secondary dwellings where people can't afford to get back in and own their own land. So yeah, that was some interesting insights in terms of drivers. Yeah, and some of the ways in which some of the things are dealt with is Lismore Shire Council have a DCP chapter on buffers. So yeah, there's some interesting work there that others may be interested in around. There's a 200-metre horticulture buffer, for example, and ways in which people kind of do a deems to comply with a 30-metre veg buffer and 80-metre separation. So, but yeah, there's often issues, I guess, again, with smaller properties that might not be able to meet those buffer distances. Yeah, I guess those are a few insights from our team, just moving forward.
Great, thank you for that, Selena. It looks like, and certainly from my team, from my discussion group as well, there was quite a few challenges, and there was some interesting ways that councils were addressing those challenges. Certainly, affordable housing and succession planning also was talked about, and having some criteria in place or developing a rural land strategy. So yeah, that was interesting to hear those different perspectives. So we'll just move to poll question 3. Just to get an idea as to whether councils have sufficient guidelines to develop a policy position on, rural workers, secondary dwellings and dual occupancies. So if you could quickly answer yes or no, and then we'll bring up the results shortly. Sufficient guidance, 42% said yes and 58% said no. So it looks like there's a need for further support for councils in that area. We'll just bring up poll question 4. So just to get an idea for future forums, what might benefit you most, you could just tick one of those topics. So the highest is 49% said agricultural industry specific information. More councils talking about their experiences is the next one, and then 31% said they like the current forum, and there's a few others and a few more time in breakout rooms. Great. Thank you very much for that. That's really good for us to structure the future forums. We now move into the open forum for questions. So Does anyone, and we have some questions here in the chat.
Wendy, while we're waiting to go through them, I just thought I'd just give a bit of a plug. So currently DPI are running or starting to commence preparations for an education program. So as part of that, we will be offering a diploma level course, a diploma unit course on land use conflict risk assessment or risk, so basically around the LUCRA guide, and then as part of that we'll be doing particular talks and education components around industries and particular topics as well. So there's probably going to be a bit of crossover between the work that we're doing here and also offering tutorials on specific topics for ag. So yeah, it's good to see that people wanted a bit more ag specific information, and it's certainly something that we can lean into now that we know that that's sort of going to be helpful for people.
So if people have questions for either DPI or the councils, if you could raise your hand and then we can answer those questions, that would be great. Natalie Hancock.
Yep. So
okay.
yeah, so I can talk to that one if you like, Natalie. So DPE and DPI, obviously we're part of separate organisations, but we got some feedback from Forum 1 that there probably were some divergent views between the two departments. We've been working a little more closely with DPE around some of their work. We had a little bit of involvement with agritourism, not a lot, but we are hoping to start to bridge some of that divide with some of the cross-government response to the Ag Commissioner work as well. The other thing is we do get a bit of consultation as well. So we take the views from councils that we hear through our general day-to-day work as well as through this forum to inform the policy responses that we give to DPE when we are consulted on their work. So while we are separate organisations, we do try and we are trying to work together a bit more closely in this space.
Great, thanks for that, Tamara. Does anyone else have any questions? Stuart. Position on secondary dwellings and detached dual occupancy dwellings.
Yeah, so we don't have a formal position at this stage, Stuart. We have, you may be aware, a while ago developed a draft guide on secondary dwellings and detached dual locks, but we haven't got a publicly sort of certified position on the two. Our view probably is that there is a lot of rural dwellings in the rural landscape already. The Agriculture Commissioner found that dwellings in the rural landscape were one of the key causes of land use conflict and pressures for fragmentation and driving capital growth and the like, and putting them out of the reach of farmers. What we haven't done yet is formalised that into a policy position, and I guess the information we get at this workshop, as well as some of the work that DPE are working on in the background as well, will help us probably come up with a bit more of a policy position. Like in short, sort of with the way our team tries to work is we try and discourage fragmentation of the rural landscape, and we try and discourage dwellings generally dispersed just because of that land use conflict risk. So usually we would try and avoid those two if we could. And particularly we do have a fairly strong position that we don't like to see those types of developments count towards housing targets, just because their spread through the rural landscape is likely to have far more of an impact than if they were to be placed in towns. But yeah, happy to work towards that if that's something that you see would be useful. The sound mapping project, where's it up to? So we've got a second draft map in draft at the moment. We're just having a look at that. We've got a draft policy that will go out on exhibition with that map that we're just testing for the second time with the Department of Planning. Once we get feedback from the Department of Planning and the second map is finalised, we'll have that out. So we were hoping to have that out this month, at the end of last month. We've just trying to tidy up a few things around the edges, and then if we can get it out before Christmas, that'll be great. It'll go on exhibition if it does go over Christmas until sort of early February to give people plenty of chance to make comment. But we are still aiming for this year, but we are getting close to Christmas, so we'll wait and see. Otherwise, we'll hope to get it out early next year, politics pending. Ag impacts, to adequately assess ag impacts for dual locks and secondary dwellings. Do you have time frame for the mapping? Yep, so I just talked about that. And can you give us an indication of what the policy will include? Yeah, so the map, so yes, probably. The Ag Commissioner recommended no strong prohibitions in the policy, and also the data that's been used to inform the SSAL map has been its regional data, so not cadastral level data. So we're proposing to use the policy in the strategic planning framework, and we are trying to use the policy as similar to the Planning for Ag and Rural Land Strategy Guide to say that SSAL should be zoned RU, basically either RU1 or RU4. Now, that's not to say that council should go and do a whole new comprehensive LEP. It's a case of when you do your next comprehensive review, starting to look at the allocation of your agricultural land and working out, you know, do you need an area for ag? If that is an area that you're intending to support into the future, because as we know, the landscape is, you know, quite broadly used, the rural landscape, and there is currently a fair bit of homogeneity between the use of the RU2 and RU1 zone. So it's just trying to, similarly to the res zones, make sure we have an area that's sort of identified in the longer term for agricultural uses or primary production uses, and then an area of the rural landscape which is used for those more tourism and other types of uses as well. But that's sort of a bit of a very brief overview of the draft policy, and that policy will go out on exhibition with the map, so people can make comment on that and whether it's reasonable or not and what support you might need or not. Stuart, suitability for agricultural purposes has been a comment raised in arguments to support additional housing. Will DPI's position consider land capability and suitability? Yes, so the land capability and land suitability mapping have been key inputs into the SSAL map. So yeah, definitely they've been a consideration, and they are definitely a consideration currently in the DPI responses that you get currently to referrals from your gateways or proposals. Lots of SSAL questions. Will the SAL mapping for the Northern Rivers be updated, giving the basic data quality used? We're looking at the Northern Rivers mapping. That was quite extensively tested by CSIRO at the time, but we are having a bit of a look at that. Is there a threshold for applying those zones to SAL? Lots of SAL questions here. We are going to run webinars on SAL when we have it on exhibition. So I'll just answer this one on SAL, and then we might wrap the meeting up. But if there is there a threshold for applying some of these zones to SAL, as some of the parcels identified in the mapping are quite small or isolated? So yeah, that was one of the key issues with the first map, and we are trying to move away from that at the moment to have a bit of a smoother map that you know, is more suitable for that strategic planning framework where it's sort of intended to be applied. So hopefully you won't get any of those small sort of fragmented parcels of land. Yes, and definitely there has been a threshold applied. Are you planning on providing better and more consistent guidance on how to apply rural zones and MLS? Yeah, definitely. So yeah, Michael, definitely. So that was one of the forum comments from Forum 1 as well. So we actually have some work on minimum lot size starting next year. We have someone that's been working quite a lot in that space and has done a lot of research work for us coming on board to particularly work on that component. So really hoping that we get some good outcomes out of that. I had breakfast with some friends this morning and they were saying the block next door to them, a few thousand acres, is being cut up into 100-acre lots. So it's going to be suitable for growing roses and running a horse. And, you know, that's a function of the MLS probably not being suitable for ag around here, but forcing people into creating larger, almost lifestyle allotments than what we would sort of like. So there's some perverse outcomes that we're seeing across the state in relation to MLS. So we know it's an area we need to work on, and we are proposing to work on that in 2023. And then in terms of the guidance on applying the rural zones, yes. So the Planning for Agriculture and Rural Land Strategies Guide starts to touch on that. The SAL policy goes into that a little bit further. DPE's policy that came out when the standard instrument was introduced, it talked about the rural zones and how they should be applied and provide distinct outcomes for each of the rural zones. I know that it was sort of bastardised a bit through the standard instrument process and hasn't necessarily been applied as that rule, that guideline sort of suggested that it should be, but as a general rule, that guide isn't too bad. But yes, I think there's a paragraph on each zone, so potentially could be broadened a fair bit. But yeah, definitely we're proposing to do a bit more in that space too.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for everyone for all those questions. We'll take your questions on board and take those up in following forums. I'd just like to conclude the forum. So thank you everyone for attending. We've had some really good discussions in the breakout groups, and thank you for the councils for their presentations today also. The next forum will be held early next year, and we'll advise you of the date probably towards the end of this year. If you didn't have the opportunity to raise any matters in this forum that you wanted to, if you could please include your comments on the ideas wall. We'll be sending a feedback form to you, and that feedback form will help us tailor future webinars. So if you could provide us some feedback on that, that would be great. You can also provide any further comments on that form as well. So the recording of this webinar is also going to be posted to the project's social pinpoint page on the website, so you can listen to this forum at a later stage, or other people can listen to this forum. So the recording ends now, and thank you everybody for your participation.